Good morning. Today I'm going to be talking about this idea in person-centered the idea of unconditional positive regard. So unconditional positive regard, which I might refer to as UPR because it's quicker to say, it's one of the three tenets or the three pillars of person-centered therapy. And most therapeutic approaches, they will start with using person-centered ideas at the heart of it. Person-centered therapy was developed by Carl Rogers. So his book Here on Becoming a Person. This is really helpful to read, as is this book, The Person-Centered Counselling Primer by Pete Sanders. And that's good because it's very thin and it's kind of quick and easy to read, and it outlines all the key points of person-centered therapy if you're interested. So the three pillars of person-centered therapy are empathy, unconditional positive regard, and that the therapist should be congruent. So today I'm talking about unconditional positive regard, what it is, what it does, and I think how transformative learning about UPR was for me, not only for my practice, but for as a thing that I offer myself. So let's get into that. So if we break it down, unconditional positive regard as something you give to somebody means that without condition, whether a person is young, old, no matter their gender, no matter where they come from, no matter their presenting issue in the therapy room, without condition, the therapist will offer them positive regard. And positive regard is basically care, compassion, empathy, and they will regard them, so consider them or look to them or treat them positively, kindly, and with care. And on the surface, it kind of seems quite obvious that if you're going to speak to somebody about your problems or what you're going through, they should treat you with care and compassion. Of course, that would be expected. You want to be empathized with, you want to be treated warmly, especially if you're going into therapy to talk about something that's really difficult for you or something that you worry if you spoke to a partner or a friend or family about that they might treat you differently or they might judge you. Therapy only really works if UPR is being offered. And I'm just going to look at this. So on page 59 onwards, chapter 7, there's a whole section on unconditional positive regard. Carl Rogers, he was writing this in 1959. It was quite a long time ago, but it still very much stands. The concept of UPR to describe this condition where acceptance, respect, and valuing is offered to the client, otherwise known as prizing. So you valuing them, respecting them, holding them in high esteem, basically. Empathy, UPR, and congruence are called the three core conditions of person-centered therapy, in that you can't offer UPR without empathy, and you can't offer empathy and UPR without this thing called congruence, which I might talk about in another video. So if we focus on UPR from what I've just said, you might think, well, I do care about everyone and I empathize and I listen to anyone and I don't judge people, and maybe that's part of the reason that you want to become a therapist or counselor. But if you go deeper, it's a lot more difficult than it seems on the surface. So in my counselor training, part of learning about this UPR was to consider what conditions of worth, had been put on me throughout my life currently, whether that's by society, by friends, by family, thinking of expectations. So what are the conditions for me to be cared for by my parents? What are the conditions for me to be loved by my partner? What are the conditions for me to be an acceptable man, woman, married person? What are the conditions for me to be embraced positively by society? And I realized there were certain things that I felt I could do or I could say that would maybe change how I was treated. And until you think about that, you don't realize the conditions that are put upon you. Or this could even be something like what job you get into, perhaps, your parents put a condition upon you of, we want you to go to university, we want you to do well in school, we want you to get a certain job by this age, you need to earn a certain amount of money, you need to be married, if you're a woman you need to have children, you can't be gay, you can't be trans, and those are all conditions. And it's almost like saying, I will treat you positively if you do this, I will treat you with care and non-judgment as long as you do these things. And Carl Rogers Carl Rogers looks at these conditions, the conditions of worth. So we internalize these things and think, if I do this, I have worth. If I present like this, I have worth. So when we go into the therapy room, it's about being accepted by the therapist or the counselor who is offering you, without condition, positive regard. You can come into this session and you can vent for the entire session. That's fine. You can come into this session, not want to talk to me. You can just use the session as a place to co-regulate with another person without talking. You can come to this session and talk about the same thing for 8, 9, 10, 15, 20 sessions, if that's what you need. I'm not going to judge you for that. I might ask you whether it's helpful. I'm happy to do that. I'm not going to judge you. In training, something we reflected on, and something I get my level 2 students to think about. It's a bit of a controversial question, but it's a good thought experiment, I guess, when you're thinking about UPR. Imagine that you're a counsellor. I want you to imagine your nightmare client. Who are they? What do they look like? What do they sound like? What's their presenting issue? Some people say my nightmare client would be somebody who's exactly like my mum or reminds me of my mum. My nightmare client would be somebody who's really misogynistic, sexist. My nightmare client would be somebody who is on the sex offenders register or who is a paedophile. Remember that these people come to therapy and you might be the therapist, and you have to be able to offer unconditional positive regard to everybody. And that's not to say it's easy at all. And I think that's why being a counselor or therapist is so much more difficult than people realize, and why it can take up to 4 years to qualify as one. Because without realizing, the world that we inhabit and the relationships that we have can often demand things of us and put conditions on us to be a good partner, a good friend, a good son, daughter, parent. And you bring all of that stuff, whether you're aware or not, you bring that with you into the therapy room. And you might, well, you will have reactions to the clients who are sat in front of you. You might have your own assumptions about them. You might judge them, things that they share. You might think, oh God, I don't like their approach, or I'm judging what they're telling me. I don't agree with what they're telling me. I don't think it's realistic that you should like every client. You might not like them, but for the purpose of the professional therapeutic relationship, you have to offer these core conditions of empathy and unconditional positive regard to anyone and everyone who comes in. And this is where self-awareness, which is Unit 5 of counsellor training, this is where Unit 5 is really important, because without doing some of that inner work and looking towards yourself of, what response am I having to this person? Why is it really hard for me to offer them unconditional positive regard? What conditions do I expect from them in order to offer them empathy and care? And what do I do about that? With the example that I gave about a sex offender, for example, sometimes terms of a person's probation, if they've been released from prison or have a probation worker, sometimes the conditions of their probation would be, you have to go to therapy for at least this many sessions. And somebody has to do that. Somebody has to be that therapist and counsellor, and people do have capacity to do that. I myself have worked with sex offenders before. Going into that, having an assessment sheet, reading it, I, as probably we all do, interject our own views of that person and our own judgments before we've met them. And then when the person comes into the room, you have to realize that empathy and unconditional positive regard, care, support, compassion for somebody is required in order to create a trusting therapeutic bond. But as I say that, you might be thinking, offering empathy or offering UPR to somebody who has committed a crime against another person, should we do that? Should we extend empathy to people who have done bad things or who have a different political leaning to you? Do they deserve empathy? And is there a limit to the empathy that you can offer? And the world of counselling and therapy allows the practitioner to have things that they themselves maybe aren't comfortable with working with. But I would really encourage trainees to try and work through those things. I'll go back to that same example because this seems to be the one that people struggle with the most. So I won't work with a client who is on the sex offenders register. If that is a caveat to your work as a therapist or counsellor, that's okay to have that boundary because you need to look after yourself. For example, if there's just something you can't put aside, or there's something that will affect you negatively emotionally and means that you can't extend empathy and you can't extend unconditional positive regard to somebody, I think it's reasonable to say, I'm not happy to work with this. I'm not happy to work with this presenting issue. But it becomes a bit difficult if you were to say, I won't work with this demographic, because that in itself is very judgmental and it assumes that this demographic is like a monolith. And in person centered therapy, it's about the person, not the group. So if you have an assumption or a judgment, or let's call it what it is, which is a prejudice towards a group of people, through training, you will really have to confront that judgment because that is not about the individual or the person in person centered therapy. I think it's important that we are challenged by the clients we work with for the better. Particularly if you're working in an agency setting, you will have to see whoever is referred to you. You can say, I'm not happy working with this presenting issue, but to say I won't work with a certain demographic is quite judgmental, and it also implies that there is a condition of worth and you're kind of projecting that condition of worth on somebody based on your own fears and prejudices. Unit 3 in counselling training also talks about this, and it requires trainees to unpick and understand what their own fears and prejudices are, because God forbid you have a client come to you who is the exact embodiment of all of your prejudices. How are you going to extend empathy? How are you going to extend unconditional positive regard unless you've unpicked those things in training? For me, learning about unconditional positive regard really helped me have more acceptance and self compassion. This isn't just about the client and offering it to them, but I think it's genuinely helped me be more open and be more safe and be more accepting of everybody, even friends, and it strengthened my relationships definitely. The ability to listen to somebody and support them whilst not judging them, it is huge. When I learned about unconditional positive regard, I started turning that towards myself. That has really genuinely been very transformative. Maybe as an exercise, I would encourage you to think about, what are your conditions of worth? What things do you believe make you a good person, make you worthy of love, make you a good child, make you a good parent, make you a good employee? And then ask, where have those things come from? Why have I internalized them? The other exercise, I would encourage you to think about, who would your nightmare client be? And ask yourself why that is, what work you might have to do to work through that, and accept that we all have that. I suppose a criticism of UPR is asking if it's even possible. Is it possible to not judge somebody? We all make judgments, and sometimes we make judgments based on our own safety. And we might make a judgment of, okay, I need to be careful about this person because they've done this, or they present like this, or they've said this to me. So is UPR possible and is it helpful? But I think that's where work around boundaries comes in. If you assess that somebody isn't safe to work with, that's very different. Within the assessment part of working with somebody, you can determine whether somebody's safe or not. And then be honest, can you offer them UPR? Can you offer them empathy? And if not, having the humility and self awareness and congruence, honesty to say, I don't think I'm the right therapist for you. Finally, I think UPR is a really precious trait for somebody to have, particularly now, there's a real thing of cancel culture, and that people only have one or two lives. Like, if you imagine having 5 lives, we only really give people 2 or 3, and then we're sort of like, okay, I can't be in relation with you. Unconditional positive regard encourages us to still show up, to still support somebody, to still have non-judgment, to listen, to try and understand that person, even when they're making mistakes, even when they're exhibiting maybe unhealthy behaviors. The empathy part in tangent with unconditional positive regard is important for that reason, because if you can empathize and say, I'm not a perfect person, this person's really struggling with this thing, I can empathize with, having my own difficulties sometimes, I can empathize with being self centered sometimes, whatever it is that they're presenting. If you have empathy for somebody, you can offer unconditional positive regard. I hope that makes sense. As I say, the person centered counselling primer is really good to learn more about this. And Carl Rogers' Unbecoming a Person, which is a lot thicker and it goes into things in a lot more detail. If you're interested in it, I can definitely recommend. So that's UPR, and that's part of person centered theory. No matter what a practitioner, what modality they go into, the staples of person centered theory will be there: empathy, UPR, and congruence. So I hope that was interesting. If you've got any questions, or if there's anything I didn't cover very clearly, pop me a comment. And thanks to everyone who has subscribed so far. Okay, take care.